Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended lifeforms are so amazingly primitive that two of them still think doing a podcast called Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea is a pretty neat idea. These podcasters have, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Actually, this is the solution. Hey Bryan, what's this?
This is our discussion of the BBC radio drama, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency.
Yes, it is.
That's a lot to say.
Yes, it is. So we're going to talk about Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which proves to me that you should do a radio show first and turn it into a book, rather than doing a book first and turning it into a radio show.
Well, yeah, and I can completely understand your sentiment here. What's the most interesting aspect of a radio show is that they are very much aware that they have to communicate everything that you need to know about the story in a verbal form. I mean, sure, they have, sound effects and that kind of thing, but that is so small and unrelated to the story that they don't have the opportunity, like an author does, to create an atmosphere with, the offhand comment and the background arrangement of what's going on. So here in the audiobook of the story, we find, many of the answers that you and I had questions about.
Yes, we do.
In this version of the book. And I'd like to attribute that to our friend Dirk Maggs being a part of this audiobook, because he seems to be an individual who understands the story at a greater level.
Yes. So some of the other people that are in this, there are only a couple that I think are very, very well known, at least to us here in the United States. First one being the person that played Richard is Billy Boyd, and he played Pippin in The Lord of the Rings.
Wonderful.
And then you pointed out to me that the Detective Sergeant Jilks was played by a gentleman named Jim Carter, who is the butler in Downton Abbey.
Yes, exactly. And very distinguished voice, very distinguishable voice.
Yes.
And I do love the way he plays Jeltz in this story. It's kind of interesting to me because I don't see, in the next audio drama for The Long Dark Deep Time of the Soul, Jeltz is a much more comedic character, or at least he's poked fun at more than he is in this first book.
Yeah.
But in terms of this audiobook, his lines and the lines of the priest, to me, are the best lines in this production.
Right, okay. So, what did you think of the opening of this? I personally had a few problems with it, and I'm wondering if you just took it with a grain of salt, or if you had the same type of problems that I had.
Probably just let it roll over me like water off a duck's back. I don't recall anything specific.
So, again, this is a radio show after we've done the book, so there's no hidden things here. There's no spoilers or anything. So, the being who eventually becomes the ghost that is trying to correct his wrong, this is where we get to see what went wrong.
Right.
In the book, he asked the monk to tell him what he wanted to hear, and the monk did.
Right.
Which I can buy. However, there are alarm bells and everything going, caution, overload, warning, overload, system, overload.
Yes.
I don't care how much you want to believe that there's something wrong. And they could have gotten away with it, and I would have totally been okay with it if he just said, Monk, is this a false alarm? And he said, I believe it is. Then it would have made sense. But he ignored all of the warning signs, and he didn't ask to believe it was a false alarm or whatever. So this really goes beyond a simple careless mistake. This is gross negligence.
Well, he does say later in the audio that he believes that the priests were picking up on his desire for everything to be fine. So that's why they continued to lie to him throughout the entire process. So he does attribute it to himself at that level, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there are alarms going off in the background, and you know, that's the nature of audio. It's allowed to do those kind of things.
Well, right, but it changes everything to me than what it was.
Mm-hmm.
So after the opening, where we hear the explosion and then do all the opening credits, they have Dirk's answering machine taking a message from Gordon Way. And that came out of the blue for me, because I don't remember that happening in the book.
You're right. I was a little bit surprised by that, but here's one of the answers. Why was Dirk on the building across the street from Susan's house looking at the window? We don't know that in the book, but here clearly we're told in the audiobook, oh, he was hired to make sure that Richard is on task and getting his project completed.
Oh, I kind of missed that, but no, that now I understand. I always just assumed in the book that Susan happened to live across the street from Dirk's apartment.
It made it sound like that in the book. That was a good assumption, but here in the audio, it's clear that he's been hired, you know?
He's been hired to keep an eye on Richard. So that's why he knew it was Richard, and that's why he knew it was Susan's apartment.
And you know, it was a funny interaction there with his secretary saying, whoa, if that's Richard, then who's Susan out with?
Right.
You know, it's like, I thought you were the detective. But I thought you would be bothered more by that beginning audio in that beginning part where he's talking about good old-fashioned detective work.
Oh, I didn't, I let that roll off of me like water off a duck's back.
Now that's something that usually wouldn't let you wouldn't let go of too easily.
No. So then we hear Gordon calling Susan's answering machine. And through sound effects and aside conversations to himself, pretty much everything that happened in the book at this time is happening.
Right.
There's a song, there's a regretted message, there's a priest carrying a sack, there's Gordon jumping into the road in front of Richard, there's a cop. So all of that is just all crammed right in. And like you were talking about with these radio shows and how they have to do things, people talk to themselves for no apparent reason and just say the weirdest things so we know what's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
So now we know that Dirk has been hired, and he is spying with binoculars. He's giving a play-by-play to his secretary, who is not writing any of it down. He seems to have a much better relationship with his secretary right now than he did in the book ever.
Right.
So he sees Richard climbing into the window of Susan's apartment, and Richard listens to the messages to find and erase his, but then Dirk calls him and answers the phone, and there's that whole thing.
Right. Yeah, this is very similar to the book. You can easily get lost in the timing, but here in the audio, they definitely started off in a different place.
Yes.
In the original book, Richard goes to the Coleridge dinner, and the whole Coleridge dinner happens, and then we hear about this invasion into Susan's apartment. But here, we start right off the bat with him going into Susan's apartment, and everything else that we learn about the Coleridge dinner, etc., comes in much later in the story. And it becomes the rehash that we'll talk about shortly.
Yes. So Susan arrives home, from her date with Michael Wenton Weeks. And what I want to say here is there is one more actor that I wanted to mention, and that is the actor who plays Michael Wenton Weeks. Do you remember who he's played by?
No.
Michael Fenton Stevens.
I remember it was a funny name.
It's like the same pattern. Three. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Both first name Michael. The second one rhymes with Wenton. And then Stevens. I don't know. I just found that funny.
That is very
Maybe
good.
That's why he got the job.
Yeah, probably. I would believe it.
So Michael mentions the monk after he says nobody will believe him.
Mm-hmm.
So he throws in this thing about the monk where everybody knows about this monk, and that's how you know who's possessed.
Right.
And that was a little bit different than the book, but I understand why they had to kind of do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you even hear, as Richard is climbing, he's repeating phrases from Coleridge's poem. So you hear the mumbling of the poem as he's climbing the wall. So you're led to understand that he's being possessed at this time. Right, right. So at the Coleridge dinner, Reg is telling the story of his appointment as Regent Professor of Chronology. Mm-hmm. The three questions are brought up, but there is an interruption before the third one was stated. But it's actually the first one, if in fact the answers are yes, no, and maybe. It was similar to the book, but it was presented a little bit differently. Right. So Richard goes to Dirk's office, and Dirk's secretary was more like I remember. And Dirk gets barraged with phone calls. So they still put in this phone call after phone call after phone call. And Richard finds out Gordon is dead, and he is under suspicion, and Dirk suggests hypnotism. So they just run full speed into all of these. There's no trying to talk somebody into anything. It's just full speed ahead. Right. And that kind of ends the first part. Mm-hmm. In part 2, it starts off with Sergeant Jilks talking to another officer at Richard's place, and the sofa is mentioned again as being stuck. Now, before you talk about how did the sofa get stuck, and it needed to have the door to be delivered, I'm going to compare it to a barbed fishhook. Things can go in, but they can't come out. So the arms of a sofa can be pushed to get around a corner. But once you bump it past that corner, you are now stuck. And there is no way to get it out. So I've never had a problem with a stuck sofa because I've done that with a tractor and something I was pulling and a tree to where the wheel shoved up against and popped in, and then I was stuck. I couldn't go forward or backwards because the tree was hitting two different wheels. Anyway, so I don't have a problem of how did the sofa get stuck, because in my mind there's a very clear answer to that. So Richard calls Susan from a phone booth outside his place, and Jilks comes up to the phone booth, and Richard pretended to be a foreign restaurateur taking a phone order. And Jilks didn't recognize Richard, he said, because he kept his head down. Right. So then it jumps to the electric monk going to the gas station and explains to the attendant who and what he is. That way we know who he is. Right. And he wants to be a labor-saving device for him, like a VCR. And he offered to watch the TV so the attendant could work. So Richard goes back to Dirk's office where he gets hypnotized, watching a spoon tied to a metronome, and he explains everything that happened the night before at the dinner. We hear his job history and attempt to write accounting software that converts spreadsheet numbers to music. He mentions Reg's magic trick. We hear a reading of the beginning of Kubla Khan. They read a second part that gets really weird. To Asgard, where Odin's son quells the rhinoceros, and lo, he stays his. Reg calls it the longest poem in literature. Right. So there is one of the answers that we didn't really understand too well in the book. And in fact, just to jump ahead a bit, there's hundreds of pages to this poem, not just 3.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And they mention that later in the book. They have a version of the book. He pulls it out and sees that it's now back to the 3 pages that we know today.
Yeah, his book is a lot thinner.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, we experienced things as they happened. And after the hypnosis, Dirk just says something like, now I know everything. He doesn't repeat everything. But here, we don't really hear anything that happens. And Dirk tells us what happened by explaining to Richard what he learned from hypnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So then it jumps to Michael Wenton Weeks and his mother letting him know that the magazine that he was editor of has been sold to Gordon Way. And he's not happy about that, obviously. Again, this is a lot of one place, other place, one place, other place, back and forth, back and forth.
Right.
So Richard promised to have a drink with Reg, so he went back to his place. And there, of course, is where we learn that there is a horse in Reg's bathroom.
Right.
And here is where Richard is reminded that he forgot to bring Susan to the dinner.
Mm-hmm.
After Richard asked the porter about a horse on campus, we hear the exchange between the 2 porters talking about a different instance that evening of being asked about a horse and telling the guy to go shoot off. So same thing as the book. Still a little bit weak, but, you know. Oh, and at the beginning of this, we didn't mention that Gordon fully explains that he has a trunk load full of shotguns.
He does.
For the Americans to shoot his rabbits.
Right.
So Richard awakes from the hypnosis, and then he remembers seeing Gordon jump out in front of him in the road. And that's how Chapter 2, or Part 2, ends.
Mm-hmm.
Part 3. Now Jilks is at the gas station, and he's questioning the attendant, and asked if Gordon was acting strange. And they fully go through that whole, well, what do you think is strange? And it's just a bunch of noises that he makes. And you get an idea that he's doing stuff with his hands because he says, if I did this with my hands.
Yeah, that was a good scene. At one point, I wish I knew exactly when the reference was, but at one point, I think it's here where he's talking about detective work and understanding what they're looking for. Is it Jelks that says he's looking for telltale pieces of pocket fluff?
Oh, I didn't hear that, but it might have been.
And I'm like, oh yeah, gotta check it out. They got the reference to the video game.
Yeah, they do lots of little throw-ins for the fans.
Mm-hmm.
So Dirk tricks an officer who is guarding Gordon's Mercedes to leave. He then has to relay everything that has happened to Richard and Miss Pierce via his psychic powers for the audience to keep up. And he got it spot on of what Gordon did.
Exactly.
And then Miss Pierce is feeling cold. So they do a lot of, I feel cold. The room is cold. Do you feel cold? Whenever the ghost is around.
Oh, gosh. When the policeman is interviewing the gas station attendant, he says, do you know what Way looked like? And he says, oh, yeah, he looked like Doctor Who, you know, one of the fat ones.
Right. Yes.
Again, they're going to stick it all in there for you.
Yes. Another thing that they did early on when the monk was describing himself, he talked about only having 2 arms and 2 legs because it was easier to sit on a horse that way, and you always looked more sincere on the horse. And they did give him the extra eye for a grand total of 2.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing things very specifically to give you a picture of what this electric monk looked like, which you're trying as the reader in the other book, you're only assuming that the being that blew up the ship wasn't a humanoid biped.
Right.
And they made the electric monk look so absurdly different than that you totally knew it was a robot. but
Right.
it looked just like a human. And, spoiler, we'll get to hear kind of what the Salaxolons look like at the very last of this audio play. So Michael Wenton Weeks shows up at Susan's in order to console Susan and tell her that his knowledge of music has increased so much that he cannot appreciate Vivaldi anymore. Also that he dreamed about mud and slimy creatures and he had something to undo. So they're really hammering home that they're possessed. Like in the book, it wasn't clear until the very end.
Right.
With the book, you're reading all of this stuff that doesn't make any sense that you're supposed to remember. And then in the last paragraph, he's going to sum up everything that happened and you're supposed to remember back and go, oh yeah, that all makes sense. Detective Sergeant Jilks and the officer that Dirk bamboozled came back. And Jilks mentions he needs to find a field for a horse. So he's gotten the horse out of Reg's place and is looking for a field for it. Miss Pierce asked why Dirk went to jail for the exam papers, and Richard explains, and there's a flashback to Dirk in college mumbling in his sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So they did a little more with the exam papers than they did. Well, they didn't do more. They did it a more deep dive into a single instance versus the overall explanation.
Right.
And I did look in the book, and something that I did not catch in the book, which was very obvious in the radio play here, was during Dirk's retelling, he says that Gordon thinks he saw a pale figure in the car with Richard.
Right.
And I didn't remember that from the book, but it is vaguely in there.
Oh, really?
It was not as obvious as they put it here, but it was in there in all of this. I don't even know how to... The way he writes, it got lost.
It does. It must have. Because I did notice that in the audio much more prominently than in the book.
So now I want to explain to you and to anybody else who may have missed it. I'm going to read the passage in the book that talks about this. So it doesn't happen right as it's happening. This is after Gordon gets back to his house and he is lamenting on what's he going to do, lying ceaselessly forever awake at 4 a.m. and all this other stuff. And he says, the worst moment had been when he had seen Richard on the road. Richard's face, frozen white in the windscreen. He saw again his face and that of a pale figure next to him. So that's how they did it in the book, which the pale figure next to him is making it sound like he saw his reflection in the windshield.
Right.
But it's not.
No. He saw the ghost.
Right, he saw the ghost because he saw again his face. So it's like, what's this again? Like it's just weird. So it didn't surprise me after looking for it why I missed it the first time.
Yeah, pretty subtle.
So the monk shows up and he basically becomes a commercial for himself, explaining to the officer what he is.
Just after he does his little commercial to introduce him to the gentleman there at the police station, he turns to the officer, "What's your name?" And the officer says, "Luke." And he said, "Well, Luke, I am your father."
Right.
Oh, they had to stick something in there for the Star Wars fans.
Right.
It's also this part where he mentions the Beatles thing, where he says happiness is a warm gun.
Oh, yes. Yep. Yeah. And here's something that I found weird, and you tell me if this was in the book. Dirk says he wants to hypnotize Richard again.
I don't recall that being in the book at all, but I thought that was unusual.
There was one hypnosis session last time, and this time there seems to be 2.
And it's the second one where he, plants the post-hypnotic suggestion.
Right, because now he has a suspicion of what has happened.
Right.
So the cops got the horse and they brought it to a field, and it mentions that the horse is covered in pink dust. Again, not stuff that was in the book, but because they want everybody to be able to keep up, they keep hammering home a lot of these details.
Mm-hmm.
So the monk was reflecting on events in a tree when he is reunited with his horse. And that ends part 3. Part 4. Gordon tries to appear to his sister Susan while she is practicing her Mozart. Susan is unaware, except for a chill. Richard wakes from hypnosis, and Dirk says 2 of the things Richard told him were impossible, and those are the things he wants to focus on. The ghost, who has been trying to possess different people, found a match with Michael. And they do this whole, oh, it's a match, oh, it's a perfect match, it's a perfect match.
Mm-hmm.
So Dirk is accusing Richard of exhibiting irrational behavior, and Richard is defending himself and his actions. And so while walking along the canal, Dirk mentioned his old maiden aunt from Winnipeg, and Richard jumped into the canal. So Dirk had to play his recording of the hypnosis session. And so after listening to that, Richard tells Dirk that there was a message from Gordon on Susan's answering machine, but it was in his apartment. So that was a really weird non sequitur for me of how he jumped from, here's why you jumped in the canal. Oh yeah, there was a message from Gordon. What I don't understand is why he got everything except for there was a tape in Richard's apartment, and he didn't get that from the hypnosis. That was just something that Richard remembered after he came out.
Right.
In Richard's apartment, Dirk plays with Richard's computers. He then tried to swipe the tape, but got caught by Jilks. So they listen to the tape, and Jilks is excited because it confirms the time of death of Gordon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Dirk listens on farther, and he hears Gordon's voice as a ghost on the tape.
Right.
So Dirk starts communicating with Gordon's ghost, but he does not know for sure that it's Gordon. He just knows that it's some kind of a spirit. And so Gordon is getting mad, and things are flying around the room. And like in the book, Jilks comes back in, he leaves, and says, I don't want to see that again when I come back. And he comes back in, and everything's fine. And then he throws Dirk out of the house. So this is a part that I found interesting, and I guess it's all to set up the part 2 of this radio show.
Mm-hmm.
So at Susan's house, Richard is telling Susan about the band he was in called The Reasonably Good Band. And they cut to a recording of Hot Potato. The 56th recording that they made was released by a different band, Pugilism and the Third Autistic Cuckoo. They made a fortune, and Richard and his band got nothing. Why is this here? I mean, is it solely to set up the second book?
Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of.
But that's not what happened.
I know.
He
Well, that's not
overheard.
what happened in the second book, for sure. So
Right. So the whole way, well, maybe I was sitting at a table and overheard them talking about a hot potato is a story they just made up to fit the song that they were just given that they didn't write, because they had to make up some kind of a how did it get written story.
yeah.
I don't know. I just found it really weird that Richard wrote Hot Potato.
Or Richard's band. Yeah, that was
Richard's
weird.
band, yeah. So Susan asks Richard to come over to her place. And the electric monk gets arrested.
I really enjoyed the conversation between the electric monk and Jilts in the interview area, but it was funny that that's not where the funnier lines of the conversations were.
Right.
At one point, the monk is telling someone the things that he is willing to believe. He's even willing to believe that Governor Actor is able to fight off an army of cyborgs.
Yeah. A governor actor with an Austrian accent, I believe.
Yeah,
is also
exactly.
put in there. Right.
These are the kind of things that he's willing to believe for you. So I really thought that the things that they jammed in there, made those interactions really good.
Right. So like in the book, Dirk tries to write the answer to the conjuring trick in childish squiggles. So all he had to do was interpret it as opposed to figure it out. And Miss Pierce tells Dirk to find a child, and he gets the answer, and he rushes to Richard to bring him to St. Sed's to see Reg.
Right.
Part 5. So Michael is on the train telling his stories to the partiers. So Dirk and Richard arrive at St. Sed's, and they talk to the porter about the horse and the monk.
Mm-hmm.
Then they cut to Jilks, and he's interrogating the electric monk, and the electric monk confessed to everything. Like, every time he was asked if he did something, he was like, yes, absolutely, positively. He also chose to worship Jilks and asked if his sins were forgiven. So he decided that he was going to turn Detective Sergeant Jilks into a god. So Dirk and Richard show up at Reg's and have tea. Richard retells the magic trick to Dirk and shows him the notebook on the table with the abacus. The secret to the trick is revealed, and they are told that they are standing in the time machine.
Right, and here again is where one of the answers becomes very clear. This is where we learn that Professor Chronotis actually is the original person to be given the title of Regis here at the school, because he mentions how difficult things were in the 14th century.
Right.
So he has lived through all of this.
It is confirmed without any question here, but it is really, really implied in the book that he was. But they don't actually come out and say it, I don't believe.
No, but like you said, here in the audiobook, they just come out and say it.
Right, oh yeah. So Gordon is now at Dirk's office trying to communicate with Ms. Pierce. He thinks that Susan is in danger and wants to warn her. And somehow he gets Miss Pierce to dial the phone for him. It was kind of pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So Dirk asks Reg who he is, and he is told that he doesn't know anymore. So Reg doesn't even know who he originally was.
Right.
And they find out that Reg has a strict policy to not use the time machine. However, since he did it to please the girl at the dinner, he now has a disproportionate reaction to a situation. So Reg also says that he has not used the time machine because it felt like someone was trying to make him, and that was a difficult thing to fight because it's something that he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then they really spell out, with no room for doubt, the path of the people and the way the ghost has progressed from one person to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And then Reg goes and shows them what he wanted to do, see the dodos.
Right. And isn't it funny? I mean, just like in the book, from here on out, it feels like a mad dash. I mean, you know, it's like a chase scene from an old movie. They're just zip, 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 zip.
So back at Dirk's office, the police arrive to a nearby building. Gordon is watching the spectacle, and a woman walks up and talks to him. It's Michael's mother. Mm-hmm. Michael killed her, and now she is a ghost, and she can talk to Gordon.
Right. She relates her little story, and then zip, she's off to heaven.
Yep. He's like, wait. So Michael arrives to Reg's with a suitcase of scuba equipment.
Yep, again, just right out and said it.
Right, yeah. I liked in the book that if he just said he arrived with a big suitcase, and then when they got to the place, we found out that there was scuba in it, that's the way it happened in the book. And I kind of liked, because it kept you wondering what's in the box or what's in the bag.
Yeah, exactly. We had no idea. We thought it was like all kinds of deadly weapons and all kinds of things like that. I mean, that's the supposition.
So part 6, the final part. Michael tells Reg that he needs the time machine to undo a terrible mistake. The ghost told them that, unlike the other two, Michael was willing to be possessed. And Dirk wanted to call up Michael and get it verified, of which he did. So Gordon is tearing up Dirk's office to get Miss Pierce's attention to tell her something. And through knock once for yes and two for no, he He eventually gets her to dial his sister so he can leave a message on her answering machine.
Right.
So the ghost, through Michael, tells his story. He tells them the ship is still in orbit, and Dirk says, I want to see that ship. So then on the ship, it depressurizes due to its routine, and we get an idea of what the Salaxolons look like from the description of the spacesuits on board.
Mm-hmm. And did you write down what they said? I didn't have time to write it all down.
No, I didn't. But it was something like 17 legs, 3 noses, which I don't know why there would be nose spot in a in a pressurized suit. But
right,
hey.
right. Except when I heard that 17 legs and 3 noses, didn't you think of the movie? Or the creatures that created deodorant before they created...
Yes. yeah, it was similar.
Mm-hmm.
So Reg comments on how it was nice of the computer to warn them in English. He was told of the universal translators as being standard equipment on Salaxola.
Mm-hmm. No babelfish needed.
No, but they took a page out of the Hitchhiker's Guide because it said that Salaxolon destroyed their planet with wars due to the translators projecting real feelings and intentions regardless of the spoken word.
Mm-hmm.
So the same as the babelfish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation.
Never let a good idea go to waste.
No. So Richard is in the monitoring room, and he is listening to the music of life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And he's basically in tears. Michael is suiting up to walk through the poisonous atmosphere to stop the launching of the ship. And there's a joke in here. I didn't write it down because I didn't think it needed to be said, but now I've changed my mind. So while Michael is suiting up, one of them, either Reg or Dirk, is helping him. And at this time, Susan is talking to Richard on the phone and asking him where he is.
Right.
So Richard is coming down, and he walks in pretty much as Michael is asking for more Vaseline. And one of them says, there's never enough Vaseline. And Richard says, I'm just going to leave you two alone. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Mm-hmm.
So as Michael thanks them and says goodbye, Dirk says, so long, and thanks for all the... and then just trails off.
Mm-hmm. They couldn't bring themselves to do that.
So on the phone, Susan had talked to Richard and told him about Michael killing his mother, and now that he is killed once, killing again, like killing the entire human race, will be easy.
Right, exactly. And they make that so much clearer here in the audio than in the book itself. Because even though we kind of laughed at the fact that they say it's a perfect match, well, that's the part that makes it a match. He's willing to kill his own mother and the entire human race as a consequence of being a perfect match.
So Dirk goes to see Coleridge while he is writing Kubla Khan under the guise of doing an interview that lasts nearly an hour. Mm-hmm. And this causes Coleridge to forget most of the poem he was writing under the influence of the ghost with a bunch of nonsense and a bit about an albatross. Right. So in the book, they keep mentioning the albatross and they keep doing quotes of Rime of the Ancient Mariner and all of that. But here they do make it very clear that while he was writing Kubla Khan, he started talking about nonsense and albatrosses, and that's how it got into the Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Right. Okay, so now I've got a question for you, because I remember hearing this during the audiobook. I thought Richard said, well, it made so much more sense than an asteroid, which to me meant that the original reference in their first timeline in the Ancient Mariner was an asteroid, not an albatross.
Yes, but That didn't make any sense.
I know.
So it's an albatross.
But why was it an asteroid? I mean, I don't know.
I thought that was the worst forced dumb joke that was in this whole thing. So I do remember him saying it, and I did not understand why they thought that was needed.
I don't either. In thinking about those two, both of those items are icons, if you will. An asteroid or a meteor and an albatross are both harbingers of death.
Yeah.
That after seeing one, you're likely to have the other. So they're both related in that sense. But why in this story this is part of it, I don't get it.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
Well, it's funny because we just talked about the Salmon of Doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Salmon of Doubt, in the early chapters, they're talking about an asteroid that could be a planet killer. And we're told that the story is related to, 5 million years after the Earth got wiped out. And militarized kangaroos, which they're also talking about teaching how to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So the the idea of a asteroid coming to kill the planet again comes back and remains part of Douglas Adams's lexicon.
Yes, it does. Oh, like in the book, Reg leaves, goes behind a tree, and then comes back with a beard. And he went to the ship and points to the sky, and it gets destroyed.
Yep, explodes.
And Richard asks Reg to go back in time to get his sofa unstuck and delivered to his place. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't a dinner reservation that got the sofa stuck. It was going back to unstick the stuck sofa.
Right. So they changed things around to make it make more sense.
Right. Which they didn't change in the beginning, which Dirk said there were two impossible things. One was the time machine, and the other, he didn't say, but in the book, was the sofa being stuck.
Right.
But like I already mentioned, I can tell you how the sofa got stuck. Because I got one right here around the corner halfway up my stairs. So Richard called Reg and thanked him for saving the music because Reg decided to take as much of the music as he could, even though it was only a small fraction of what was there, and he gave it to a man named Johann Sebastian Bach.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, Dirk gets a call from Mrs. Sorkin, and her cat had died and is not missing and does not know who Dirk is, so he sent her the revised bill.
Right.
Saving the human race, no charge.
Oh, gosh. The more I think about this, and obviously we've reached the end of this tale in this audiobook, I've been thinking a lot about it. And the funny thing is that of all the characters in the book, Dirk is not really my favorite. I mean, Susan, Michael, Reg, and Richard are more interesting to me than Dirk is.
Yes, I agree.
And I think it's funny because in the Long Dark Deep Time of the Soul, we get Dirk back, and then we're introduced to other characters. So I always thought that was interesting because I didn't know how they were going to do a TV show or a movie or anything like that, because the likable characters don't go from one book to the next.
Miss Pierce.
Miss Pierce, but then she's just a soda machine. And
That's right.
So, hey, if you like soda machines, and good on you.
Yeah. She's got that Coke bottle shape.
Oh, there you go. Oh, gosh. Well, Jeff, what do you think? We made it to the end.
We did, and I guess what I want to say about this, and I've been trying to figure out how to describe it. And what I want to describe it is, it's like an inside joke.
Mm-hmm.
I do not believe that if you were unfamiliar with Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, you would understand a word of this radio play.
Yeah, I think you would have a big challenge there.
I mean, even just scrutinizing it the way we have, trying to listen to the fast-paced background characters throwing out aside lines that are under the dialogue you're listening to, trying to get the whole picture. It's insane.
Right. But what I really appreciate about Douglas's writing and the book itself is that you do get a feeling for what Dirk means by his approach to detecting. He doesn't use normal detective methods. He uses a holistic approach, as he says in his
Right.
conversation. But the book makes that clearer. It's easier to understand what's going on, that Dirk is allowing a life to revolve around him, and intersecting with his life are the answers that he's looking for, which is a brilliant concept, and I really like that. You're correct. I don't get that in this audiobook. I get a kind of a scruffy, not really good detective going about business and stumbling into answers when I listen to the book.
Right.
And for that, I agree 100%. But the inside jokes, I really liked them.
Yeah. Well, no, those are inside jokes within this inside joke.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
called this an inside joke because you had to know the story in
You
order
did.
to appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe there's somebody out there who could take it all in and completely understand it, and great. I mean, absolutely great, but no way I could have.
No, that's a challenge. So, Jeff, what's next?
Well, of course, we're going to have to do the second radio series, which is the BBC radio version of Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, I am as well. But now that we know what we're doing next time, this is the end. So yes, we're going to talk about the Dirk Gently's the Dirk Gently
with your new lips.
Dirk.
I told you it was a mouthful.
No.
You didn't believe me when I said it, did you?
Wow.
Oh man! And again, when the policeman is when the policeman is entered. Shit! Now I've got it.
First day with the new lips. Thank you for listening to this. A new episode is released on the first Thursday of every month. A special thank you goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. Visit our website at digitalwatchesareaprettyneatidea.buzzsprout.com. While there, you can find links to all of my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy inspired t-shirt designs. You can contact us via email at digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook at Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. You can message us on Twitter, or should I say X, at Watches Idea, and our Instagram is Watches Idea Podcast.
This has been a Froods for Thought production.